For 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople had been more than stone. They were a promise. They told kings, emperors, raiders, and entire armies that the city could be wounded, starved, and surrounded, but not easily taken. Men had died beneath those walls in numbers no chronicler could truly count. Siege towers had burned there. Ladders had snapped. Fleets had failed. Ambition itself had broken against that line of towers. Then, in the spring of 1453, something new rolled across the earth. It moved slowly. It groaned under its own weight. It needed teams of oxen, roads repaired in front of it, and men walking beside it like servants beside a sleeping beast. It was not graceful. It was not ancient. It did not belong to the world of swords, shields, and sacred banners. It belonged to a darker future, a future of smoke, thunder, shattered masonry, and fear. When the Ottoman cannons arrived before Constantinople, they did not merely threaten a city. They threatened an entire idea of war. For centuries, Constantinople had survived because geography and engineering had worked together like two hands locked around a treasure. The city stood between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between Old Rome and every hungry empire that came after it. On one side lay water. On the other stood the Theodosian walls, a system of defenses so formidable that they seemed less built than grown out of imperial confidence. There was a moat. Then an outer wall. Then an inner wall, higher and stronger, crowned with towers. Behind that rose the city itself, crowded with churches, palaces, cisterns, markets, and the memory of emperors. To attack Constantinople by land was to advance through layers of death while defenders rained missiles from above. To attack by sea was to face chains, currents, and the stubborn protection of the Golden Horn. In earlier centuries, this had been enough. A wall was not just an obstacle. It was a machine for converting time into survival. Every day an army waited outside, it consumed food, lost animals, spread disease, and risked rebellion. A besieging force needed patience, discipline, money, and luck. The defenders needed only to endure. But by the 15th century, endurance was no longer what it had been. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern half of Rome, had shrunk until it was almost a ghost wrapped around a city. Its emperors still carried ancient titles. Its churches still held ancient rituals. Its people still looked from their walls with the pride of those who believed they guarded the last light of an older world. Yet beyond the gates, that world had changed. The Ottomans had risen from a frontier principality into a disciplined imperial power. They had cavalry from the plains, infantry hardened by campaign, engineers, administrators, tax systems, and a ruler who understood that conquest required more than courage. Sultan Mehmed II was young, but not careless. He had inherited enemies who doubted him, advisors who tested him, and a capital that was not yet worthy of his ambition. He wanted Constantinople not simply as a prize, but as a center. A city of emperors for a new empire. To take it, he needed to solve a problem that had humbled generations. The old methods could still kill men. Ladders could still reach walls. Towers could still be pushed forward. Mines could still be dug beneath foundations. Hunger could still turn civilians into shadows. But Constantinople had been designed to resist exactly those pressures. What Mehmed needed was not merely another army at the gates. He needed a force that could change the meaning of a gate. Gunpowder had been known before 1453. Cannons had already appeared in European and Asian warfare. Earlier bombards could frighten horses, break gates, and batter weak walls. But they were slow, unreliable, dangerous to their own crews, and difficult to move. Many commanders saw them as useful tools, not as a revolution. They were loud. They were expensive. They cracked. They took time to reload. They were not yet the elegant artillery of later centuries. But even an imperfect weapon can become decisive when it meets the right target at the right moment. Among the men who offered their skill to Mehmed was a cannon founder often remembered as Orban, or Urban, a master of metal and proportion. The exact details of his life are blurred by time, but the weapon associated with him became part of the legend of the siege. It was immense, a bombard large enough to hurl stone balls of terrifying weight. It required massive quantities of bronze, skilled casting, careful cooling, and a ruler willing to spend treasure on a machine that might fail, burst, or sink into the mud before it ever fired. Mehmed accepted the risk. That decision mattered. Technology does not change history by existing in isolation. It changes history when power chooses to feed it. The great cannon was not just metal. It was mines supplying ore, forests cut into timber, animals driven into harness, craftsmen paid, roads strengthened, powder mixed, stone carved into shot, and commanders willing to organize all of it toward a single purpose. Behind every thunderclap stood a system. So the cannon came. Imagine the defenders watching from the walls as the Ottoman camp spread across the fields. Tents multiplied. Earthworks rose. Standards moved in the wind. Fires burned at night like a second city under the stars. And then, among the ordinary signs of siege, they saw the extraordinary: heavy guns being placed in the lines, their barrels dark and wide, their crews moving with the caution of men who served something powerful enough to kill them. The Byzantines were not ignorant. They understood danger. They had survived too much to confuse noise with victory. Yet the psychological effect of those guns must have been severe. A sword had to reach you. An arrow had to find you. A trebuchet stone could be seen in the air. But a cannon changed the atmosphere itself. First came preparation, then a flash, then a concussion that seemed to strike the chest before the wall. Smoke spread. Birds scattered. Horses screamed. Men flinched before they knew what had happened. And then the stone hit. The Theodosian walls had been built for a different kind of violence. They could absorb missiles, resist ladders, and force attackers into killing zones. They had survived earthquakes because they were repaired by people who understood that the wall was the city. But cannon fire did not behave like older siege pressure. It repeated impact against chosen points. It shook mortar loose. It cracked facings. It turned careful masonry into weakness grain by grain. The first shots were not enough to bring the city down. The great guns were slow. Some could only fire a handful of times in a day. Barrels had to cool. Powder had to be measured. Stone balls had to be loaded with laborious care. The recoil and blast could damage the guns themselves. Artillery in 1453 was still crude, half science and half gamble. But siege warfare had never required instant destruction. It required persistence. Day after day, the Ottoman batteries fired. Smaller guns added their voices to the deeper roar of the great bombards. The defenders repaired at night what had been broken by day. They filled gaps with earth, barrels, timber, and rubble. Men who had once trusted the walls now had to rebuild them under exhaustion. Sleep became shallow. Prayer became more urgent. Every crash carried a question: would this be the blow that opened the way? Inside the city, the population lived between ritual and dread. The emperor, Constantine XI, moved through a capital that was both sacred inheritance and military trap. He appealed for help from the west, and help came, but not enough. Genoese soldiers under Giovanni Giustiniani brought expertise and courage. Other defenders stood beside them: Greeks, Italians, sailors, monks, nobles, and ordinary men pressed into the final labor of survival. They were not cowards hiding behind stone. They fought with discipline. They repaired breaches. They countered mines. They guarded the walls in darkness. They endured bombardment that would have broken weaker hearts. The tragedy of Constantinople is not that its defenders failed to understand the moment. It is that they understood it too well, and still had too little with which to answer. Mehmed, for his part, did not rely on cannon alone. That is what made the siege dangerous. A commander fascinated by one weapon can become its servant. Mehmed used artillery as part of a larger design. He tightened the landward siege. He controlled approaches. He brought ships overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing defenses that had protected the harbor for generations. He used pressure everywhere, so that the defenders could never rest their full attention on one danger. The cannons broke stone. The strategy broke balance. There were assaults before the final assault. There were failures, bodies in ditches, shattered ladders, cries beneath the walls, and moments when the old city seemed once again to prove its stubbornness. Each repulse mattered to the defenders. Each day survived was a victory of breath. But the Ottoman army could absorb losses that Constantinople could not. The empire outside the walls had depth. The empire inside them had memory. As May deepened, the damage became harder to conceal. Sections of wall were weakened. Breaches were repaired but not restored. The defenders were fewer, more tired, and stretched thin along a vast perimeter. The city still stood, but standing is not the same as being whole. A wall can remain upright while the world behind it begins to accept that the end is approaching. The final attack came before dawn on May 29, 1453. Darkness covered the movement of men. The Ottoman assaults came in waves, forcing the defenders to spend strength before the elite troops entered the struggle. Irregular troops went first. Then more disciplined forces pressed in. The noise rose from the ditch and the shattered ground, drums, horns, shouted orders, the crash of weapons, the crack of firearms, the groan of bodies against obstacles. At the breaches, the battle became intimate. The age of artillery had opened the wound, but men still had to climb through it. Steel still met flesh. Shields still struck shields. Hands still gripped stones, ladders, and broken beams. In that narrow violence, the future did not look clean or mechanical. It looked like mud, blood, smoke, and faces lit by fear. Giustiniani, one of the key leaders of the defense, was wounded and withdrew from the fighting. Whether his departure was unavoidable or misunderstood, its effect was devastating. Morale shifted. Confusion spread. In siege warfare, perception can kill almost as quickly as a blade. A defender who believes a position is lost may abandon the very ground that still keeps death away. Somewhere along the walls, Ottoman soldiers found opportunity. The exact sequence has been argued across generations, but the result is beyond dispute. The defenses were penetrated. The pressure became irreversible. Men who had stood against weeks of bombardment and assault were overwhelmed. Emperor Constantine XI is said to have thrown himself into the final fighting, disappearing into the collapse of his city and his empire. Constantinople fell. The fall was not only a military event. It was a rupture in imagination. The city that had survived Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and countless moments of crisis was now in Ottoman hands. The last emperor of the Romans was gone. Hagia Sophia, the great church of imperial Christianity, would become a mosque. The routes of power shifted. A new capital rose from the captured city, no longer the exhausted remnant of Byzantium but the beating heart of Ottoman rule. And the walls, those ancient teachers of patience, had learned a new lesson too late. It would be too simple to say that cannons alone conquered Constantinople. History rarely gives one weapon that much authority. The city fell because of Ottoman organization, Byzantine weakness, strategic pressure, naval improvisation, manpower, leadership, timing, and the relentless will of a young sultan. But the cannons mattered because they made the impossible feel practical. They turned confidence into calculation. They forced defenders to answer a kind of damage their system had not been designed to endure. After 1453, no ruler could look at medieval walls in quite the same way. Fortification did not disappear. In fact, it evolved. Engineers began to lower walls, thicken them, angle them, and build earthworks capable of swallowing shot. The age of the high, proud curtain wall gave way to the age of the Tres Italienne, star forts, bastions, and geometry shaped by gunfire. Stone had to learn humility. Architecture had to bend before chemistry. The cannon also changed power itself. Great artillery demanded money, specialists, supply chains, and centralized authority. A noble with a castle could once defy a king behind stone. But kings who could afford guns could reduce those stones to bargaining pieces. The balance between local fortress power and centralized state power began to shift. The sound heard before Constantinople echoed far beyond the Bosporus. For soldiers, the change was even more immediate. War became louder, smokier, less personal, and more terrifying at a distance. Courage still mattered, but courage now had to stand inside concussion. Discipline still mattered, but discipline now had to hold while the ground trembled beneath invisible force. The battlefield was becoming an industrial space long before factories ruled the world. There is a strange sadness in the story of Constantinople. The defenders were not backward fools defeated by a clever machine. They were heirs to one of the most sophisticated defensive traditions in human history. Their walls had worked for centuries because they had been brilliantly adapted to the dangers of their time. But no design is eternal. Every system, no matter how strong, is built against the threats it understands. Then a new threat arrives. At first, it looks crude. Too slow. Too expensive. Too unreliable. Too strange. The old order laughs at it, fears it, studies it, and tries to fit it into familiar categories. But the new force does not need to be perfect. It only needs to improve faster than the old world can adapt. The cannon before Constantinople was not just a weapon. It was a warning cast in bronze. It warned that walls could become targets. It warned that prestige could become weight. It warned that memory, however glorious, could not substitute for renewal. The city had survived for 1,000 years, but survival can become a kind of sleep. Outside the walls, men were building a different century. When the smoke cleared in 1453, the stones of Constantinople still stood in places. The towers did not vanish. The skyline remained. People still prayed, traded, argued, suffered, and lived beneath the same sky. But the meaning of the city had changed forever. An empire had ended. Another had announced itself. And somewhere in the silence after the guns, the old world could hear the shape of the modern one approaching.